Consumerism reduces us to what we can earn, spend, and purchase. And ultimately, that reductionism is devastating. Consider today the emptiness that tremendous affluence has left us with, and the hunger of the human heart that consumerism only seems to increase. To where can we turn for the deepest answers to life's hungers? In the midst of affluence, are you hungry? Today, we're going to consider together the realities and effects of consumerism and the ever-increasing pursuit of affluence upon us as human beings, as well as the scale of human trafficking in our world. We're going to be thinking about what some of these things mean for our humanity and whether belief in God has anything to offer us today in this complex world. We'll be trying to take a step back from some of these big features of our day in order to think carefully about our own lives. And rather than just putting the noise-cancelling headphones on and staying on that treadmill of our everyday grind of life, sometimes it's good to wake up, look around, listen, and take action. I suggest, firstly, that we live in a context where we are pursuing affluence but experiencing emptiness. We're constantly sold the idea that if only we can increase our material wealth, that might make us happy. But I want to ask you the questions today. Where does the evidence lead? Michael Norton, a Harvard business professor, studies the connection between happiness and wealth. And he did a study in which he asked more than 2,000 people who had a net worth of at least $1 million, including many whose wealth far exceeded that threshold. He asked them on a scale of 1 to 10 how happy they were. And then he asked, how much more money would you need to get to 10? All the way up the income spectrum, Norton concluded that basically everyone said they needed 2 to 3 times as much as they already had to be perfectly happy. Robert Skidelsky says, experience has taught us that material wealth wants no natural bounds. But those material wants expand without end unless we consciously restrain them. Capitalism rests precisely on the endless expansion of wants, and that is why, for all its success, it remains so unloved. It's given us wealth beyond measure, but it has taken away the chief benefit of wealth, the consciousness of having enough. Is there such a thing as enough? It was Thomas Merton who said, we may spend our whole lives climbing the ladder of success only to find that when we get to the top, our ladder is leaning against the wrong wall. Jesus Christ put it like this. In Mark's gospel, he asked, what does it profit a person to gain the whole world but to lose their soul? That Greek word there, soul, psyche, originally meant breath as the sign of life. But it encompasses much more than our physical breath. It speaks of the soul, the immortal part of the person, distinguished from our body, and also speaks of our mind and our understanding as the organ of thought. In other words, what is at stake, says Jesus, is your whole sense of well-being as a person. The innate truth of who you are, the you that makes you you. Oliver James, in his book Affluenza, found that when, as human beings, we center our lives on money, possessions, and personal experience, what actually happens is that we begin to suffer from increased levels of depression, anxiety, and relationship breakdown. He found that the more materialistic we are, the less loyal, helpful, and joyful we become. Clive Hamilton commented, people buy things they don't need with money they don't have to impress people they don't like. Oliver James again says that affluenza is a virus-like condition spreading through affluent countries. And by far the most significant consequence of this, he writes, has been a startling increase in the incidence of mental health illness in children and adults since the 1970s. Now, the relentless pursuit of affluence, as if that might give us that sense of having enough, is partnered by the reality of consumerism and the consequent dangers of that worldview behind it, of reductionism. In our society in which people often have what they need, the job of advertisers has been to create false needs. And so our society is geared around making us want more stuff. But tracking the impact of the advertising industry since the 1950s, studies have shown and explored that fallout of 60 or 70 years of false needs. And the fallout gets worse with successive generation as people experience anxiety and depression in increasing numbers. Reductionist consumerism is harming our mental health. It's also harming the very environment of our planet. Research shows how plastic has been found in more than 60% of all seabirds and 100% of sea turtle species that mistake plastic for food. Every year, 8 million metric tons of plastics enter our ocean, on top of the 150 million metric tons that are currently in our marine environments. There are 5 massive patches of plastics in the oceans around the world, and these huge concentrations of debris cover large swathes of the ocean. The one between California and Hawaii is the size of the state of Texas. In simple terms, it seems that if you talk about damage to the environment and the pollution of our oceans, it's simply a symptom of that rampant throwaway consumer culture. That's the disease. Now, journalists and environmentalists often want to look at sectors of the global economy that seem to contribute to this kind of damage. Transportation, industrial goods, services, agriculture are all blamed and taxed and admonished. But this way of measuring blame misses something crucial: us as people. And researchers have begun to see that and to question whether we should actually tilt blame away from businesses per se or technocratic institutions towards a different villain, ourselves. Is this a moral question? Reducing consumption would require personal sacrifice. We might need to look at our grandparents and great-grandparents, waste less food, buy and consume less throwaway fashion that we wear twice. We may need to draw lessons from how others have lived. But how might that be even possible? From where could a change of the human heart come? Is there an agency outside of ourselves that is able to actually challenge our individual selfishness and empower us to change, to be transformed, to even, dare I say it, deny ourselves? Has such a message ever taken root in hearts and minds before? What is so troubling about unbridled and unquestioned consumerism is it that it proceeds from a reductionist philosophy, a view of the human person that narrowly defines men and women by their economic potential and the satisfaction of their material wants. Consumerism reduces us to what we can earn, spend, and purchase. And ultimately, that reductionism is devastating, not just to our mental health, but also to our planet. So I suggest to you today that as human beings, we need a bigger category. We need a bigger worldview, which might be able to hold us as human beings with all our potential, ingenuity, and capacity for relationship, a way of seeing the world, a philosophy which we find a place in, which does not diminish us, but also a worldview which is realistic about our selfishness and fallenness, as well as our hungers and our emptiness, offering us transformation of the human heart. The Christian faith offers precisely such a possibility. Christians will often point to what they read in the Bible about the value of every human life, rooted in this idea that all human beings are made in the image of God. Genesis 1:27 speaks of God creating human beings in his own image, male and female. Now, truth matters. The ideas that we believe have consequences. If as human beings, male and female, we are image bearers of a divine creator, underpinning the sacredness of our lives, we will have responsibilities to steward this planet. We will have responsibilities to one another. But in the same way, if we are just slime, if we are just here by chance, the result of the strong eliminating the weak, there is no reason to be overly concerned about consumerism, the emptiness of others, the pointlessness of life, or the destruction of the earth. We just need to make sure we can consume as much of it as we can while we're alive. We live in a world in which the possibility of human sacredness, that God-inspired idea that our lives have essential value, that we cannot and should not be reduced to what we can consume or how much money we can make, has never been more under threat. Previous generations fought for the abolition of slavery and the rights of human beings, but these battles are by no means won. Today, we don't just face a crisis of the fabric of our planet around us. We face the enormous phenomena of human trafficking. Human trafficking just means the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of a human person. The means of it is through force, coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, and abuse of power. And the purpose is exploitation, including the prostitution of others through forced labor. The Trafficking in Persons report of a global report of the United Nations said that in 2016, at any given time, 40.3 million people worldwide were in modern slavery. Consumerism is driving human trafficking, whether it be the sex industry, the drug trade, or the products that forced labor produce at vastly reduced price points for bargain hunters. The industry is driven by demand and by greed. Now, we may think of this kind of thing as happening somewhere far away, India or South America or Thailand, and that it affects the products that we buy, electronics or chocolate or textiles, but it is actually closer to home. In Europe alone, redressing this crime right here on our doorstep is a huge struggle. And so I want to ask you the question, why would you care? Outrage in the face of injustice makes sense to us as human beings because we instinctively sense this is not the way things are meant to be. But is that impulse really rational? Does outrage or a sense of injustice actually make sense of our own wider beliefs about the world and about God? What is the foundation of human outrage at the evil and suffering of human trafficking? If life doesn't have a transcendent source, if we're nothing more than a collection of atoms that has learned how to think, why would we care? After Charles Darwin first published his book on the origin of species, a British economist, Herbert Spencer, coined the phrase the survival of the fittest. To encapsulate Darwin's idea of natural selection, Spencer was comparing his theory to his own economic principles. The central idea was that those life forms best suited to their environment would survive, and eventually less suitable attributes would be bred out of the population. Now, when combined with a materialist outlook that there is no God behind the universe and all that exists is physical matter, human beings are to be viewed as the product of chance, striving for our own survival and advancement. And the inevitable conclusion of that view is that as individuals, we need to put ourselves first in every decision. After all, what else is there other than me and mine? Ayn Rand, the atheist thinker and socialite, died in 1983, but still sells thousands of books each year. She thought that an atheist had to be an egoist. She said, every honest man lives for himself. Every man worth calling himself a man lives for himself. The one who doesn't live at all. In other words, that philosophy tells me that I should always put myself first, and that other people who come across my priorities need to be just sacrificed. Now, this way of looking at the world might justify outrage if I suffer personally or my blood relatives are harmed, but it doesn't account for a wider spread anger about pain and injustice in this world experienced by people who aren't genetically connected to me. Now, that way of seeing the world isn't unlike the predominant worldview that Christianity began in, but inevitably challenged. Jesus was born into an occupied nation under the harsh and merciless system of the Roman Empire, where rulers ruled with a rod of iron. But Christianity ended up conquering that empire with a more powerful weapon: kindness. The early Christians had an experience of a God who loved them, who'd shown them mercy. And part of following Jesus meant forgiving and loving others. And so they wouldn't ignore cruelty, even that which affected people they didn't know. They countered it by caring for the weak, the outcast, the widow, and the orphan. It was an utterly distinctive and countercultural lifestyle. Now, of course, as atheists and agnostics, as well as Christians, we're all going to experience anger and outrage when we hear about human trafficking. But my question to you today is, what can account for that anger? The Christian idea that human beings are created in the image of God would still apply whether an individual believed it or not. If life is in some way sacred, we would all have ways of seeing and knowing this to be true. A couple of years ago, an enslaved man who'd been trafficked to Britain by a violent gang and forced to work as an agricultural worker needed shelter. An anti-trafficking organisation that my husband and I support got in touch with us to ask if we could help practically. 200 fellow slaves had been found with this particular gentleman when police burst into a site in Essex in the east of England where they were being kept in unspeakable conditions and forced to work. But since the police raid, as the lawyers were preparing for the trial to convict the slave owners, one by one, the survivors were taken out, or their families back home were intimidated so that no one was left to testify at the trial apart from this one man. He needed shelter, and he needed to be off the grid for 6 months so that those people couldn't get to him to murder him before the trial. And so he came to us. I won't say where we accommodated him, but we did provide a home for him. And he was able to testify at the trial and to live to tell the tale. His traffickers received a prison sentence, and those who heard his story, including many who would not call themselves religious, we all knew that the lives of those who'd been enslaved and had perished were undeniably precious. The loss of those lives made us angry. Now, I believe that that reaction is best explained by the Christian faith being true. The Christian faith's commitment to the idea that all human life is precious because as human beings we've been created in the image of God. As we consider today the emptiness that tremendous affluence has left us with, and the hunger of the human heart that consumerism only seems to increase, to where can we turn for the deepest answers to life's hungers? The Christian faith understands the darkness and suffering of this world as real, as a consequence of the exercise of human moral choice. But human life has this transcendent source. We are bearers of the image of God. And in some deep way, we all sense this to be true, even though we may not believe in God. Christian faith understands life to be precious at this ultimate level. And so it means that it will matter at the deepest level when we or others are in pain. But is there hope? Is there more than explanation for our longings or for our outrage at injustice? I believe there is hope, and it is to be found in Jesus Christ. The Christian faith describes how God entered his creation in Jesus, living a perfect human life and going willingly to die by crucifixion for us, offering us forgiveness, redemption, offering us a completely new start, and calling us to deny ourselves and to follow Jesus. A worldview that highlighted the preciousness of life and that could help deal with the darkness of the human heart, our own need for a savior, would be able to speak to our present condition. Our emptiness and our longings, which can't be satisfied by wealth and can only be fulfilled with relationship with our Creator, both that hunger and our moral culpability, our need for a Savior, both are accounted for in the Christian faith. Jesus claimed to be the source of life in all its fullness. And it may be that you or someone you know is struggling with the meaninglessness of life. And the statistics certainly suggest that. But Jesus Christ said, "Because I live, you also shall live." Because I live, you also can live. In relationship with God through Jesus, the very life of God can be ours. If we will only come to him, we can be relieved of the burden of our sin and our shame, the way we've messed up this world, the environment, human trafficking, our own sense of moral shame. We can be relieved of that burden through his sacrifice on the cross. And he calls us to come to him, to follow him. In the midst of affluence, are you hungry? In the midst of this extremely dark world, do you need light and hope? The possibility of forgiveness, the welcome of a God who loves you, a worldview that is big enough to hold you and call you to a vision of justice in this world where all human beings bear the image of God.